Good evening, everybody. My name is Rebecca Ryan, and I am the Vice President of the Harvard Republican Club. On behalf of the Harvard College Republicans, the Kennedy School of Government Republican Caucus, and the Institute of Politics, it is my honor to welcome you to the forum tonight for this exciting event. I cannot tell you what a pleasure it is for me, as an active college Republican on this notoriously unconservative campus, to introduce tonight the current chairman of the Republican National Committee, Governor Mark Roscoe, and to welcome him to Harvard. The 2000 Almanac of American Politics called Mark Roscoe probably the nation's most popular governor. Governor Roscoe's agenda as governor of Montana from 1993 to 2001 focused largely on tax cuts and welfare reform. He managed to cut taxes by $45 million and significantly reduce welfare rolls in 1995. By 1996, Governor Roscoe had become one of the most popular governors in the nation, and he was re-elected by the largest margin in the state's history and the largest margin of any governor that year. Because of his success at presenting President Bush's case to the American public in the Florida election controversy, Governor Roscoe immediately became a prominent figure in national politics. In January 2002, Governor Roscoe was unanimously elected as chairman of the Republican National Committee and has since served as a critical link between the administration and the Republicans in Congress. His focus on uniting congressional Republicans with the administration's agenda has been important to the building of the strength within the Republican Party, as the Republicans look to maintain their control of the House and to recapture the Senate in these midterm elections. Tonight, hosting Governor Roscoe is the new director of Harvard's Institute of Politics, Dan Glickman. Mr. Glickman served as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1995 to 2001. Previously, he served as a member of Congress from the great state of Kansas. Secretary Glickman?
Thank you. Everybody. Well, it's an honor to bring Mark Roscoe here to Harvard. I would tell you that for all the people who believe that this is a bastion of liberal democratic values, today we had John McCain's campaign manager give the keynote address to a campaign conference. We have Barbara Bush coming next week, Secretary Cohen coming next week, and you. So I just want you to know that Harvard is a very fair, balanced institution. And as an avid Democrat, it's kind of strange that I would be coming here at a time when we are trying to be very balanced, which we are, but you're that kind of guy. I would ask in this crowd, how many of you are, if I had to ask you, Democrats, Republicans, or Independents, clap, and don't go crazy with this now, folks, but how many of you are Democrats in this crowd? How many of you are Republicans in this crowd? And how many of you are too smart to commit right now? How many of you are independents in this crowd? All right, well, you see that we did our best to try to make this event as fair as possible. I would tell you a quick story about Governor Roscoe before I go in to ask him a couple of things, and then we'll get to questions. While I was secretary, he and I were in a forum at Yellowstone National Park, and we were dealing with some very troublesome issues about the fact that the government was trying to deal with the issue of brucellosis-infected buffalo that were leaving the national park and going out and maybe infecting cattle in the area. And so the federal government had, as well as the state government, had an eradication scheme that involved the killing of some of these animals. And so this was very controversial, and Mark Roscoe and I were in Yellowstone Park, and we were sitting there in a very passive, positive way, and a lady comes up and she's carrying a big bucket and she says, "You're killing my brothers, you're killing my sisters," and she proceeds to throw a bucket full of infected bison guts at Governor Roscoe and myself. More of them got on him than got on me, thank God, but we have become blood brothers ever since that. So, Mark, of course, was governor of Montana and a very popular governor, but now he's in this role of being chairman of the Republican Party. And what I would like to ask you, Mark, first is that we are within a few weeks, 6 or 7 weeks, of a very important off-year election. The House and the Senate are almost evenly divided. if you look at history, there have only been 2 times, basically in the last 70 or 80 years, when the party of the president has not lost seats in off-year elections. One was 1934 in Roosevelt's term, the first re-election, and the other was in 1988 in President Clinton's second term, when that off-year, the Democrats actually picked up 6 House seats. So what makes you believe this time that you're going to do any better, or that the normal off-year elections aren't going to happen and people will vote Democratic in these off-year elections?
Well, I tend to, I believe that good policy is good politics. And I think if we go about trying to do the business of the people who elect us, and to do that in a constructive and thoughtful way, that is the best way to carry our burden of proof and to establish to them that they ought to invest their confidence in us. And so I certainly wouldn't make any guarantees, because I think we do run against the tide of history, and there are probably all kinds of metaphysical reasons for that sort of a dynamic to prevail. But the bottom line is that I believe we have had a president who has tried to be, in a bipartisan way, very active on the domestic agenda in ways that have impacted the lives of everyday Americans. You have a very significant tax reform initiative that he carried forward. You have bipartisan education reform, the most significant and substantial education reform in a generation that he worked with Senator Kennedy on. You have trade promotion authority that has been accomplished. And there are a number of additional items that are offered, have been passed by the House, that also impact the lives of Americans in very substantial ways. A prescription drug benefit under Medicare, a patient's bill of rights, terrorism insurance, a budget that I think is thoughtful and reasonable. So I believe the president has set a good example. The House has been very businesslike, and I don't think you've seen, emanating from the corridors of the House of Representatives, a lot of hyperbolic rhetoric. They have tried to go about the people's business in a way that was thoughtful and competent. There has been some significant amount of difficulty, of course, moving those agenda items through the Senate. And, of course, with Senator Daschle in charge of the agenda there and prioritizing what's going to be considered and not considered, a part of that is to be reasonably expected. But if we are successful this year in stemming the tide of history, and I think we have a historic opportunity to do that, we have good candidates, and we have a good platform upon which to run. I think that we have established that we've been competent and thoughtful and careful and bipartisan in trying to accomplish the business of the people of this country. I became convinced as a citizen and as an office holder at the state level that Americans have great disdain for nothing but intramural struggles within the halls of Congress, and they want to see something done. So if we are successful, I believe it'll be for those reasons.
But the Democrats would argue that what we see now is, of course, for the first time in 5 years, a very large federal deficit growing to well over $100 billion, that you're seeing the corporate governance scandals of the current period of time, that you're seeing the economy shaky, and most economists have said that we are in rougher economic times today than we were, let's say, 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And those are just 3 basic economic issues. And John Harwood of the Wall Street Journal had a column last week. The headline was, "Economic Anxiety Trumps War Talk." And the argument was that people vote their pocketbooks, particularly in off-year elections. So how would you respond to that argument that their pocketbooks are really being hurt right now?
Well, first of all, I do believe that economic conditions have a profound impact upon how people perceive those to be performing who serve them in public office, and I think it's a very important circumstance that will have influence upon the election. But I also have an extraordinary amount of confidence in the American people, perhaps as a reflection of having spent so many years in the courtroom and dealing with juries. But what I found throughout the period of time that I did that was that people are invested with a huge amount of common sense, good sense, and judgment. And if they have the right information, they'll make the right decisions. And I have great confidence in the American people. If you take each one of those issues that you mentioned to me, I think that they place each of those in their proper perspective. For instance, let's take the growth, normal business cycles. If you listen to Alan Greenspan's testimony yesterday, he talked about, as he has over the course of the last couple of years, the explosive growth that occurred during the 90s, and a natural business cycle that would require some rationalization And we have been going through that. We know now the recession began before George Bush became president as a part of a national or natural cycle, an economic cycle. They also know that the economy is strong in many ways. That's not meant to say that it's precisely where we want it to be, because it's not. But productivity is up, it's sky high, inflation is down, interest rates are down, unemployment is down. We have more people working, actually more in numbers than we have had over the course of the last 18 months. And the one thing that suggests difficulty to them, of course, is the stock market, which is an important leading economic indicator. I would not deny that. But I believe they place all of those things in their proper perspective. And when you take a look at the corporate governance issues as well, I think that they are able to discern what went on there. What went on there is an abuse of process by a very small minority of people who were trusted to do otherwise, granted. Those abuses were aggressively addressed by the administration, aggressively addressed by Congress, and that's the story of humanity. You know, we make mistakes and we address those mistakes in a way that serves the public interest. And I think they place that issue in its proper perspective. So I think that's why you see people continuing to spend, why the housing markets continue to stay strong, consumer spending is strong, is because they know that even though we're going through a period of rationalization, that we are poised for an economic recovery as a part of a natural business cycle. The final point. I don't think that when you talk about talk of war, that anyone is counting on that being a partisan issue. I know that the President of the United States is not. And I don't hear people on either side of the aisle treating that as a partisan political issue. So I don't think that that necessarily is dispositive of what's going to happen in the fall election.
I want to go back just for a second to this corporate governance issue, because one of the claims of some in the Democratic Party and some in the media is that most of the people who are involved in or many of the people involved in the scandals were large either contributors or friends or buddies of high-level Republicans. There's even a gentleman in the Defense Department, an assistant secretary, who was an Enron employee, and that in fact the Republicans bear much more of a burden of these scandals than do the Democrats, given their natural inclination to not regulate. And some of these issues are in fact regulatory issues, how we regulate our securities markets, those kinds of things. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's a rather myopic view. Quite frankly, when you take a look at it mathematically in a review of all of the people that have been involved or in some way have received assistance from corporate entities, you'll find, first of all, that the Democratic Party raises a great deal more soft money than the Republican Party does. Our contributors are very broad-based. We have many, many more contributors on an individual basis. And the facts are that the Democratic Party raises more soft money. Secondly, if you take a look at the number of people, let's just pick Enron, for instance, who were associated with Enron and made contributions to members of Congress, you'll find that I think something like 244 different members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And you know, I'm not one of those people who says, okay, Enron is bad, they made a contribution to a candidate, therefore the candidate is bad. I mean, that's patent nonsense. That's not the way it works. And I think, again, the American people have the ability to know and understand precisely what's going on. There's been no allegation that any government official in the executive or the legislative branch has done anything wrong in any way whatsoever. And the mere fact that somebody assists through a contribution to a candidate, Democrat or Republican, I don't think is a negative factor for consideration by the people, and I don't think they make judgments on that basis.
If I just want to switch subjects to another issue, and the issue is the state of Florida. You remember that state?
I do.
Okay. In fact, I was very, very troubled by the fact that they had such a good trial lawyer as you back in December of the year 2000. I wish you had been on my side, because maybe Mr. Gore would be President of the United States right now if you had been the trial lawyer for the Democrats as opposed to the trial lawyer for the Republicans. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that Florida recount and maybe even somehow relate to what's happening in Florida right now, where we have a governor's race that seems to be clouded by non-working voting machines again.
Well, as a preface, I might make note of the fact that, and Duncan would agree with me, having been a prosecutor himself, that even the ablest of counsel are usually overcome by the facts. And the fact of the matter is, that in Florida, I honestly believe that the facts probably leaned toward the result that was ultimately achieved. I didn't manufacture them. I just found myself in the middle of them. And I think really what happened in the state of Florida is because it was so close, is probably a revelation of dynamics that may have at least visited other places, other states around the country for many, many years, to be honest with you. If you take a look at the history of elections in this country, what you'll find is every effort made to guarantee that they're fair. Not perfect, but fair. And I can remember the debates that surrounded the conversion from paper ballots to punch cards back in the 60s and early 70s, and that was a revolutionary technology at that point in time. And that was going to eliminate all of the human error that had been a part of the process in the past. And it did eliminate a great deal of the human error. And it wasn't until we had a race that was so close, where it literally was hinging upon each individual vote, that some of the defects, as the glare of the light shone upon this situation, were exposed. And there were no single individual acts that were undertaken or omissions that occurred, purposeful or knowing or even wanton or negligent, that somehow revealed that there was fraud or corruption or any untoward influence in the election process. It just was a part of our human condition. These things happened, and they probably happened in the past, but they weren't revealed or known because the elections had not been so close. So I think what we all learned as Americans is we tend to think that everything, because we live in such a highly sophisticated technological world, is guaranteed in terms of its capacity to operate on every given day just exactly the way it was designed to operate. And that's just not the way things work in the real world. And so we found some problems in Florida. I don't think that anyone set about to do that. And in the end of the day, I think what the United States Supreme Court said is something that's very simple and very profound and is a part of our legal history for a great many years, and that was the rules that were in place on the day of the election have to be the rules that are utilized, or when the election process began, are the rules that have to be utilized when the votes are tabulated. And
what if they had said by the 5-4 the reverse of that and it had to go back to Florida? How would you felt about that? That is, 5 people decided this election. 5 members of the Supreme Court, basically.
No, I tend to view it as an institution designed by the framers 215 years ago for precisely this reason, to bring resolution to difficult issues that could not be resolved in other parts of our government, was resolved in that particular forum. You know, some people have said to me, well, isn't it a tragedy what happened in Florida? To me, it was a demonstration of the miracle of democracy and the capacity to govern ourselves. And I was prepared to accept a verdict as it was handed down, and I trusted in the system completely. I never was in any way overpowered by the circumstances. I was fairly calm about how things were unfolding, because I thought, here we were watching the election of the most powerful leader on the planet, and the entire world was focused upon what was happening. And we went through 36 days of debating these issues very candidly, with very, very strong feelings about it. And yet there was not one weapon withdrawn. There was not one missile trained. There was not one injury imposed. And I think it's an unbelievable testimony to how a free people, through discipline, which happens with 1,000 acts of them acting in accordance with what they understand their responsibilities are every single day, remaining committed to the system and to our form of association and accepting it when it ultimately happened. So I was prepared to accept it either way. And
you heard that here, ladies.
I believe that the court made the right decision for the right reasons, but I understand that not everyone sees it that way. But I do think that everyone universally accepted the verdict.
Now, what about what's happening in Florida right now with this governor's race? And I don't know whether Janet Reno today made any decision whether she was going to accept or whether she was going to fight the primary race, but it seems again that there's some horrendously defective process in the state of Florida, which again maybe has us going back 2 years ago and saying, you know what, it was bad then and it maintains itself bad now too, because it didn't happen in any other state.
Well, coming from the West, I probably am eternally optimistic about everything that people do, because I don't think they set about to do something wrong as a matter of impulse. I think what happened in the state of Florida is very simply explained. First of all, authority to conduct elections, to execute elections, is vested in local officials. And that's by state law. That's how the people of Florida want it. And I honestly believe that's the best system because it's the system closest to the people and it can respond to all of the subtle demands that they might have. Florida, after the 2000 experience, decided that they were going to correct everything that they could correct. And they invested a huge amount of money, probably close to $50 million in new technology for the state of Florida. But in accordance with Florida law and the Florida Constitution, they still had divided authority. The state would provide funding, but the execution of the electoral process and the decision on which technology would be purchased was made by individual counties. There are 67 counties in Florida, and out of those 67, 14 had some challenges. Now those were everything from defects in the machinery to not warming it up properly to some poll watchers not arriving. And really there were only 2 counties out of the entire 67 that had significant challenges.
But that happened to be Dade and Broward counties, right?
Both of which, now see...
I mean, that's fairly significant.
If I were strongly partisan, I would say, yes, both of them with Democratic election supervisors.
Yeah.
And the head of the Democratic Party was invited 3 weeks before, or 2 weeks before the election to come and talk with the Secretary of State because the Secretary of State said there are going to be problems in these 2 counties because people aren't trained properly and they're not ready to execute all of the functions that are assigned. But I really don't feel partisan about it. I mean, these are people and they're trying their best and they went through a massive change and they tried to execute as flawlessly as they could. Now what happened? Well, the governor has very little authority. The governor has the ability by executive order to extend the hours of voting, but that's it. So he consulted with every elected official, including the Democrat Attorney General, and both parties, both party chairmen, and they all unanimously agreed that the remedy to correct this problem was to extend the voting hours by 2 hours. Now, I think there have been some who have offered opportunistic comment, quite frankly, that's inappropriate and corrodes the confidence that people have in the electoral process, and I regret that. Because I don't think anybody set out to do anything wrong. I think they set out to do everything exactly the right way. I do think there were some mistakes made, but I think they were easily remedied. And that's how I think we ought to view what happened in Florida in 2002.
Just one final question for me. Do you think that we will be able to get some reasonable election reform this year, both in terms of the process reform and in terms of, equipment, technical assistance, as well as on the campaign fundraising side of the picture?
I do. Let me say, again, parenthetically, that achieving election reform has been difficult to accomplish because, quite frankly, until there's a problem, as you know, we typically as human beings don't respond. And we went through a process of electing people in this country for a period of 30 years where there really was no substantive election change. Election rules were just not mutated in any fashion whatsoever to any significant degree. In addition, we didn't invest in technology, and part of that is a reflection of our priorities. What happens is, of course, an election supervisor who has an election once every 2 years or once every 4 years doesn't feel entirely comfortable coming forward with a massive request for funds when there are so many other priorities when you're only going to utilize this apparatus once every 2 years or once every 4 years. So a part of this problem is our collective failure to address these particular issues. That said, Florida pointed out, I think, the need for us to do all that we can to assure the right to participate and as much integrity associated with that process as we possibly can. And I do believe that there will be an election bill that will be passed by Congress. It's difficult because it's easy to provide funding, which they should do, because quite frankly, not every county or district can do this on their own. But where do you draw the line between how far the federal government reaches in terms of respecting states' rights, and exercising authority properly reserved to the federal government? That's been a large part of the debate. Another part of the debate has been what kind of requirements should we have for things like identification? Should you have to prove who you are before you come and vote? And there have been debates about that. And there are also debates about should there be same-day registration, for instance. I mean, how convenient do we want to make it to vote in this country has been a part of the argument. Shouldn't people guard this this particular right that they've reserved unto themselves? Shouldn't they exercise it competently and thoughtfully? Or should we just simply make it so casual, so random, so meaningless that virtually anybody that's walking the street on the same day as an election should be able to simply sign up and cast a ballot? So that's been a part of the debate. So it's been difficult, but I do think that there will be historic election reform that will be undertaken this particular
And
year.
are you happy the McCain-Feingold bill passed?
You know as an elected office holder, and I was one.
Beware of one politician who puts his arm on another politician, you know. Keep your wallet in your pocket, you know.
Yeah, for the record, let me tell you, there's no more honorable man on the face of the earth than Dan Glickman, and I have incredible admiration and affection for him. And the fact of the matter is, as office holders, when you're in office, you are so gravely concerned about what the people you work for think about you, and you want to do everything you can to prove to them that you operate with integrity. There will be enough close calls for them to wonder what it is that influences your judgment. And so you want to make absolutely certain, because their confidence is the most important thing you can ever achieve. And so when I used to look at election reform bills that were introduced in Montana, I was for all of them, because I thought that that was one way that I could prove to the people I worked for that, in fact, they should have confidence in the system. Because if they don't have confidence in the system, then we don't have the capacity to govern in a thoughtful way and to meet their expectations. When I took over this responsibility and I really take a look at McCain-Feingold, I realized that it's not going to do what it's alleged that it can do. And I think it's going to, in the end, be a serious mistake that we proceeded in this direction. And let me tell you why. Soft money donations are accounted for by both parties, both in terms of their receipt and their disbursement. We have a clearly defined, very historical, traditional, vertical system that goes from national parties to state parties and then some recognized committees. It's very well known and understood. The funds that were donated, soft money and hard money, were accounted for both at the receipt level and the expenditure level. And a lot of people thought there was too much, and still do think there's too much money involved in politics. But let me tell you that I've changed my mind about that. In 99 and 2000, there was $3 billion that were spent on federal campaigns in this country. And think about what we do with that money. We try to communicate with each other. That's what we try to do with that money. We buy television ads, we buy brochures, we pay for yard signs, we pay for travel. That's how we communicate about what I think is the most important part of our mutual existence, and that is the political life of the nation. And in that same period of time, there was $4 billion spent on Starbucks coffee. Now, I'm a Starbucks fan, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying, and it's just Starbucks. We're not talking Seattle's Best or MJB or any other kind of coffee. $8 billion spent on adult movies without offering commentary in that regard. I'm just telling you that when we decide about proportionality, what's proportionately acceptable, I don't think collectively spending less than we do on Starbucks coffee is too much to spend on communicating with each other through a political season. So that's one thing I learned. Second thing I learned is that this law, with every best intention, and
of course, the president signed this bill, too.
That's right. It passed through a Republican House.
Yeah.
There were enough Republican senators to block it, and a Republican president signed it, all for the very reason I articulated to you at the beginning of this discussion, because they want the confidence of the people they serve. But I don't think they made an incisive judgment about whether or not this will do what it's supposed to do. What I think is going to happen is the system's going to get squashed. The parties are going to be diminished, because what we use soft dollars for is largely party organization. We disperse it to 50 states and 5 territories, and you do get out the vote efforts, you do absentee ballot efforts, you fund, in essence, the things that occur at the local level. And I think it's going to squash the system, and we're going to have now organizations which, under the law, do not have the same reporting requirements as the parties have. And as a consequence of that, they're going to be more clandestine, more anonymous, and they're going to be linked together by issues. So you will see more issue advertisement with less accountability. And that's what I think is going to happen. It's going to frustrate the framers of this law because they didn't intend that. But I believe, honestly, that's what's going to happen. There's also some other flaws in the law. Different groups are treated differently. For instance, labor is treated differently than other organized committees, because under the National Labor Relations Act, they have a separate charter. In addition to that, it usurps state authority. It dictates to the states what they can do in terms of their own law and their own control of campaigns. And it restricts the First Amendment rights of virtually everyone. And that's why you see the AFL-CIO is involved in this litigation, and so is the Right to Life Committee. The California Democratic Party is involved in this litigation, and so is the Republican National Committee. So there are grave concerns with the law. I would never question the intentions of the framers, however. I think they wanted to do the best that they could. I just don't think that they got there.
Okay, why don't we go with questions, and this is the first time I've done, oh my goodness, this is the first time I've done that. You can go to different places, so not everybody is in one place, and I would only ask you the following things. If you could give your name, if you would make the question such that it ends with a question mark and not an exclamation mark, and try to keep it as brief as possible, and one question, not a multiple number of questions per question. So we'll start with this gentleman.
All right, my name's Anders Blewett. I'm a senior at the college. I'm from Great Falls, Montana, and I have one question for you, Mr. Roscoe. It pertains a relationship you had with, or still have with Max Baucus. I know you're a close friend, and you've been a long-term supporter of Max Baucus and his senatorial campaigns. And I was wondering, in the upcoming campaign against Mike Taylor, if you were going to continue supporting him despite your being the chairman of the Republican Party?
Well, Anders, just for everybody's information, Max, of course, is a good, strong Democrat, and we have been friends, but I think we should have to define what support means before we agree and acquiesce that we're reading off the same sheet of music. I certainly supported and worked with him on initiatives to benefit the people of the state of Montana. I think he has been very constructive in being of assistance to me in the past, and I hope that I have to him. And quite frankly, if there were not a Republican candidate who were running against Max Baucus, I would probably be able to acquiesce to his request for assistance. But there is, and there are some differences. I mean, Max Baucus voted for the tax relief package that President Bush offered. He voted for the education package that Senator Kennedy and the President framed. He voted for trade promotion authority. I think he's done the kinds of things that reflect what the people of Montana would think was appropriate. But there are other things that he will not move forward on. Judicial nominations, for instance, which I think is a very significant problem. Terrorism insurance, which is keeping probably, I have no idea how many thousand workers around the country out of work because $10 billion in construction programs is not being undertaken. A Medicare prescription drug program for seniors would have been passed with more leadership in the United States Senate. And I could go on, a Patient's Bill of Rights. There, issue after issue that I would have a difference of perspective on in reference to Max's perspective. So he's been a friend. We have worked together. I like him. But at the end of the day, it's just like, as you know, in Montana, you either have to be a grizzly or a bobcat. And I'm a Republican, and so I would support the Republican candidate.
All right, thanks.
Up there, this gentleman right there, yes.
Hi, my name is Ryan Friedrichs. I'm a graduate student here at Harvard. Born in Michigan and worked actually this summer back in Michigan, sometime in the Detroit area. And what I noticed essentially is that in a lot of ways the Republican Party has stopped or in some sense given up on the African American vote and thinking it'll vote Democratic. And my question is why you think nationally the Republican Party has been so unable to connect to the African American base in this country.
You know, I think that is an incredibly important question. And I think it's the most important part of my job, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I can't escape going out to fundraisers, and I can't escape getting engaged in trying to make sure we block and tackle well in executing the fundamentals of a campaign. But the most important part of my job, and in fact the President told me this explicitly, is to reach beyond any traditions or presumptions that might have existed prior to the time that he came here. And he really believes sincerely in this. It's a matter of the heart to him. You know, we have a very, as a party, we have a very proud history of collaboration with African American communities around the country. But we lost them, I think, as a result of our own inattention through the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And I think it's incredibly sad and unfortunate that we were not more attentive. I mean, if you're going to have the confidence of the people that you live with, you have to be relevant in their lives. You have to listen. You have to prioritize. You have to respond. There's nothing unusual about that. That's how we seek and gain each other's confidence and how we feel comfortable with one another. And I don't think we did a particularly good job. And then I think that people began to accept appearances and presumptions and traditions and not recognizing sometimes that the same issues that are of import to the Hispanic community or the Asian community or the Native American community or to any community, the Catholic community in Boston, are the issues that are important to the African American community. And so what the President told me is, I want you to dedicate every effort that you possibly can to reestablish our connection. And we know, of course, that this doesn't happen overnight and it's not going to be unanimous. I mean, there are some who will not vest their confidence because they feel more comfortable with another political party, and that, I think, is entirely acceptable. But we are making every effort to reach out and to become relevant in their lives. And we'll have 60 events this year, for instance. First of all, I think to reveal the president's sincerity, take a look at his cabinet. It's the most diverse cabinet in the history of America. Take a look at all of the appointments that he's made in all of those different discretionary positions throughout the executive branch of government. Again, you will find a huge amount of diversity, a reflection of his sincerity. It's not a matter of political expediency to him. This is something that he believes in. And then we've set about, and we have a lot more to learn, to be very honest with you, to connect. So we've recruited candidates, we've tried to support those candidates, we have been involved in communities, we've tried to reach into neighborhoods. I think when you take a look at the polling, just recently there was a poll released by a group that is associated with the African American community. You'll find that the president's approval ratings amongst African Americans has gone from 19% at the moment that he was elected to in excess of 40% today, which is a huge increase. And I think it's because he has responded to things that are important to them just like they are to every other American. Education initiatives. As a matter of fact, the African American community has very strong feelings about having some choice with educational opportunity. So we just have to continue to connect in that fashion and to work for their confidence. And I think that that boils down to us being engaged and being relevant. And if we're not relevant in a sincere fashion, if we're just setting about to curry favor so we can get their vote, we'll fail. We have to set about to engage the African American community because we believe honestly that the more citizens involved in the political life of the nation, the more possibility there is for all of us to live in freedom.
Up this lady right up there.
Hello, Governor Roscoe. My name is Tammy Frisbee, and I'm a native of Billings, Montana. I'm a PhD student studying American politics and writing a dissertation on campaign finance reform. And just let me say first that I've always admired your thoughtfulness. You're incredibly articulate, and you make such a cogent argument for why we are Republicans and why we take the position we do that I'm hoping during your tenure as the chair of the RNC this will rub off on other Republicans. Let me ask you that while I understand and am persuaded as someone who studies the topic of campaign finance reform and why legislators act the way they do, that the legislators earlier this year passed campaign finance reform because they care very much about what their constituents think, I'm wondering how you would explain then why over the last several years McCain-Feingold in its various versions hasn't passed. What to you was the difference between, several years ago and the multiple attempts that McCain-Feingold and other campaign finance proponents have made and 2002?
That's a very good question, and I can only give you my point of view, of course, and thank you for your generosity. And I'm glad you're studying it and analyzing it, because quite frankly, I don't think campaign finance reform has seen its last discussion. It shouldn't. We should constantly seek to improve it. Change is always difficult, of course. No one wants to change if they can rely upon the system that they've mastered. That's one circumstance. There are other legitimate considerations, too, and one of them is people have a grave concern about diminishing the parties, the traditional parties in this country. I mean, I have as much concern for the Democratic Party as I do for the Republican Party in this regard. It's a clearly identifiable entity with a long history and tradition, very important in the lives of so many Americans, and to diminish its presence in the political life of the country, I think, is a mistake. So that's one legitimate concern, I believe. In addition to that, of course, if you are seeking to raise resources, and quite frankly, you cannot run for office unless you have the ability to communicate. And you can't communicate unless you can purchase the opportunity for that to occur. And of course, that means that you have to do everything from television to newspaper advertisements. And so when you recognize that there's nothing inherently evil about people assisting you by making a campaign contribution, it's really a manifestation of their confidence, then of course you try to decide how far is it that you can allow for that system to be operative without it being in any way a danger to the system. Now, soft money is probably the area of focus, but really you just remind me of one other circumstance that causes me to think that McCain-Feingold is probably not going to be as successful as what its authors hoped, and that is that it actually expands the limits of contributions of hard dollars. So what it's going to do is protect incumbents, and it's going to make it very difficult for new entrants into the political arena, which saddens me because I think that's what brings vibrance to our political system is new people and fresh ideas. But I think part of the problem with why it hasn't been addressed in the past is because when you raise soft dollars, they could be raised in larger amounts. And that was easier, quite frankly, than doing it in a different fashion. So I think that, too, is a very practical reason why it hasn't happened in the past.
This gentleman right here.
My name is Brian Greck. I'm a senior up in Courier House. And as president of the Harvard Republican Club, I just want to thank you, Governor Rasko, for making the trip up here. It's a tremendous honor to co-sponsor this event. And I know there are a lot of Republicans in the room. We appreciate having your presence. We're in an election year, and I wanted to hopefully have you address some of the nitty-gritty. We have some fabulous elections going on, fascinating races. New Hampshire comes to mind, California, Arkansas. I'm curious if you could address some of the specific races, where the party resources are going, and what to watch on election night.
Try to do that as briefly as you can, too, because the
Secretary always worries about me being brief.
Yeah.
As you know, it's not my strong suit. You can probably already draw that conclusion. And I will try to be brief. I think this is the most important election of my lifetime. And I've been involved in 6 as a candidate. I lost 3 and I won 3. Parenthetically, I learned way more when I lost than when I won. But winning was better, I would have to confess. And I still think this is the most important election year of our lifetime for a lot of reasons. I think, if anything, we learned as a result of what happened on September 11th that we are inextricably interwoven to every other part of the planet, and that things that happen far away are no longer far away, and that the cause of freedom is incredibly important for all of us to embrace. And why do I say that? Because I don't think that you can have decency. See, I can't understand how you can fly an airplane into a building, and I don't understand how you can strap on explosives to your child so they can walk into a crowded bus. I don't understand how people can ever get to that point. And what I've concluded is that when you don't live in freedom, and when you are the victim of tyranny, you do not have well up within you a sense of decency and respect and dignity for other people. And as a consequence of that, you don't value life in the same way. And so when I look at this election, to me what it's about is not only our local issues, which are critically important, but it's about the establishment of the world order, because I think people who live in freedom are going to continue, but those who don't are making a decision about whether or not they will. And so our leadership here in the United States of America is going to be very important in our encouragement to them making that judgment. And it's not a removed or detached judgment they're going to make from us, because what they decide is going to impact us. Because if they're filled with hate and anger and envy and jealousy and all those untoward human emotions, we're going to feel the impacts of whatever it is that they decide to do about it. So I think this is really important, not only for that reason, but for domestic reasons. And what I think is going to happen is this, that we are a country which is a reflection of generational difference that has a huge amount of parity. Now, I don't like to call it division, because I don't think it's division. I think there's a huge amount of parity. I think your generation, the generation ahead of you, maybe even the next one, almost to mine, wants to have a case proven to them before they embrace it. And so I don't think there are very many Americans who are just strident partisans. I think there are a huge group of Americans who want to have the facts before they make a decision. So these races are going to be very, very close. As the Secretary indicated, for us to be successful in holding on to the House would be incredibly historic. We think we have a historic opportunity because we have a good record. But they're going to be very tight races. 30 out of those 435 House races are going to be very tight races. And in the Senate, when I take a look at it, I tend to think of it in terms of, okay, where are our incumbents and how vulnerable are they? We were very worried about New Hampshire because we had an intramural struggle in our party. We wanted to make certain that they colored within the lines because we didn't want to disenfranchise all of the voters of New Hampshire. I think they did an exceptionally good job. Both of them polled pretty well against the opposition. So we have more than a fighting chance in New Hampshire. North Carolina, South Carolina, we lost incumbents of some significant moment. They'd been there a while. I mean, Strom Thurmond was there the year I was born. And so...
he was here when John Harvard started this institution, too, you know?
And Jesse Helms is no spring chicken. So again, we have very good candidates. They're running very good races. We feel pretty good about those races. I don't want to tell you that we're relaxing, because we're not about any of them. Tennessee we were worried about when Fred decided not to run. Texas when Phil Gramm retired. Again, very tight races. You know, 2 very good candidates in Texas. This is going to be an incredibly close race. I'm worried about Arkansas and Colorado. Again, very tight races. But you know, we're leading in each one of those, but within the margin of error. So when I take a look at it, okay, I say to myself, the incumbents are fairly well positioned. Where can we make gains? There are some that are unassailable, some Democrats in our judgment. But take a look at Minnesota, Missouri, South Dakota, Georgia, New Jersey, interestingly, just in the last few weeks has just completely changed in terms of the potential dynamics there. And so we think that we have the possibility of picking up seats there. Now, why do we want to do that? Just to win? The answer is no, at least not to me. I don't want to just win. I mean, to me, this is about selecting leadership and the capacity to govern. And frankly, we can't get any of these things moving through the Senate. We can't even get them considered. They won't even debate them. And so to me, it's all about putting enough people in place to be able to move the business of the people forward. And that's all it's about. And that's what it's about to the president. You know, he didn't get everything he wanted out of the tax reform measure. But there was a bipartisan support for what they did get. He didn't get everything he wanted out of education. And if you looked at the affection and admiration that was displayed by Senator Kennedy and George Bush for one another as they made progress, the sense of satisfaction, that's how we ought to go about making legislation in this country. And he wants to do more of that. So that's why I work so hard, is to provide him the chance to do more of that. And the governors are going to be, I think we're going to be strong in some places where we haven't been, in the Northeast, interestingly. In Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in New Hampshire, or in New York. But in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, in Maine, in Vermont, we're very competitive. We're going to have a tougher time in the Midwest, in Michigan, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, although they're shaping up well. We're going to be stronger in Alabama, in Iowa, than we have been in the past.
Have you been to all these places recently?
I have been,
Okay.
yes. And this is an ungodly job that I have. And I've learned a lot, but boy, the travel schedule is something else. So I think we'll hold on to a majority of governorships. But I would tell you plainly, I could be wrong. I think we have a historic opportunity, but I would give no guarantees. My dad was a
We hope you're
coach.
wrong. This gentleman right here.
Thank you for being here, Governor. My name is Steve Raymond. I'm a graduate school student here at the Kennedy School. And before I was here, I was actually working on getting the McCain-Feingold legislation passed at Common Cause. You gave a very interesting example about the spending of campaign money not being corrupting to the system. But my question really focuses on the raising of money and the corrupting influence of that. In the last election cycle, Enron gave over $1 million to the political parties, mostly to your party. And the president of Enron flew then candidate George Bush around in his private jet. Now, wouldn't you agree that at best, this at least creates an appearance of corruption that basically undermines Americans' faith in democracy? And at worst, it's literal corruption, and it has some sort of influence on elected officials who are the beneficiaries of this money when they're supposed to be regulating companies like Enron.
Well, first of all, let me tell you that that I respect your intuitions and your efforts, and I certainly respect Common Cause. I've had a great many opportunities to work with them, and I like the people that work there. But let me tell you this: why is in this country one of the fundamental notions that was framed in the Bill of Rights is that we presume innocence until facts are established otherwise. And why is it that we accord those presumptions to people who are accused in our criminal courts, but we don't to one another in our daily affairs? And why is it that we should, because a contribution is made to a candidate, we draw an inference that somehow influence is purchased? I can tell you as a candidate, and I would suspect, and as an office holder, and I suspect Dan would say the same thing, that I never made a decision, ever, based upon whether or not a campaign contribution was made or not. Now, does it create a reason for disclosure? I think it does. I think that there should be instantaneous disclosure. Does it provide a basis upon which our individual citizens can make their own judgment? I think that that's reasonable. But is it somehow to be suggested or presumed to be evil? I just don't think that that's right, nor is it fair, nor is it practical. And the fact of the matter is that there are all kinds of different corporations that have provided all kinds of different things to different candidates, and you'll find that just as many Democrats as Republicans ride on corporate aircraft. And as a result of that, I don't think there's ever been a case that's alleged that somehow indicates that there's been fraud or abuse by one of our federal candidates. There might have been an unintentional violation as a result of the system that was in place. Now, I grant you, though, this is a very close question. And I don't diminish what you're saying at all. But at the end of the day, you have to form a conclusion, and so do I. And based upon my experience, the best that I can do is the judgment that I shared with you.
I just would say and I appreciate your candor, I spent 18 years in Congress. I tell you, it defies the laws of nature to believe that people can take money from somebody and kick them in the butt right afterwards. It just doesn't happen. Now, it may be that I hope that people are as honest as you are, that vote what they think is right, but you just don't take the money and say, I'm going to do whatever I want to now, thank you for giving it to me. It doesn't work that way.
I could give you 1,000 examples, Dan, of that. I mean, for instance, let's talk about steel and the President's decision concerning steel. We have a strategic requirement to have some capacity to produce steel, just from a defense perspective in this country. So there ought to be some domestic capacity that's left standing. There was unfair competition from all of the people around the planet. So he decided to impose the tariffs to address that because the law required him to. Now, some of us said, well, what he wanted to do was pick up votes in Pennsylvania. Well, you know what it did in Illinois, in Michigan, in Tennessee, in Oklahoma? It did absolutely nothing for him. So I could point out to you 100 examples like that, where a judgment is made on the basis of it's right, rather than on the basis of whether or not a contribution was made.
Right up there.
Governor Roscoe, thank you for joining us today.
Your name?
And my name's Larry Harris. I'm a master's student at the Kennedy School, and I just wanted to thank you for joining us today and sharing your insight and your candor. You mentioned before that about $1 billion more was spent on Starbucks coffee than on politics, I guess, as the general kind of description of what's going on. And I might point out that that's because at Starbucks, when you spend your $3 or $4, you always get what you ask for, and it always tastes good. But I just wanted to ask you, in thinking about the $3 billion that was spent on kind of politics, in quotes, by the parties, I see political ads being run that are merely sound bites, and I think a lot of young people see politics kind of deteriorated to what seems to be an overgrown food fight between two almost sometimes immature groups battling for what seems to be the lowest common denominator. And that's not a criticism of the Republican Party specifically, but of maybe politics in general. And I'm asking, as the leader of the Republican Party, what are you doing to improve the discourse of politics and to inspire young Americans to be civically engaged and maybe get involved in government?
Well, that's a profound observation, and I couldn't disagree with one word that you uttered. The fact is, I try to do it through my personal example, to be very honest with you. I try to trust in the people I live with, first of all. I just trust their good sense and their honest purpose. I think they'll make the right decision. It may go against me, but I've learned over the course of time that if I trust them, they'll always be right. I mean, when I lost in political contests, they were right. I was wrong. I wasn't ready to hold the office that I wanted. When I lost in jury trials, I would have to go back and say, I think they were right. So you have to start with a presumption of trust in each other, and I do. And then I try to talk in civil tones. I try not to take cheap shots or be opportunistic. And I change press releases, and I change letters, and I sit all the young people I work with. This entire country is run by young people. 35 and younger. I bet the average age at the DNC and the RNC is probably about 28 or 29 years old. Very bright, very thoughtful people in both places who have so much to do with what happens in this country. And I try to bring some level of mature discussion, some discipline to that process. Don't take advantage of other people. Don't try to kick them when they're down. And I try to do it in small ways and large ways. And that doesn't mean I won't argue or I won't defend my position, because I will. But I really think it's important to elevate the discourse of this country, because it corrodes our capacity to move forward if we do not. And I think it's very important for the citizens of this nation, just like you have done here tonight, to remind all of us that that's what you expect. I mean, you expect that we'll talk to each other the same way we talk to other friends and acquaintances and family members. And I think that that's critically important. And I tell you finally, my great hope is that every one of you here will choose to become engaged in this process and influence it in your way. And all of those things coming from so many different centers of interest ultimately have an impact. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
This gentleman right there.
My name is Barry Newstead. I'm a
A
master.
little louder, can't quite hear you.
Sorry. My name is Barry Newstead. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm actually from Canada. In Canada, the role of a political party is much more active in policy, and I wonder, whether or not, that that increased policy role for the Republican Party and for the Democratic Party is much more important now. And I wanted to get a sense from you of how you see, the policies of the party as a national party, not just a series of local parties, has changed since, over the last 367 days. We've had, obviously, 9/11. We've had huge issues in the corporate sector. We've had major changes across the board, and I wanted to see how you're changing and how you're evolving as a party over the last year.
Well, I think to myself, why is it that we could get so much done in the few moments after the tragic circumstances of September 11th? I mean, how did Congress come together so quickly and pass a $40 billion aid bill? How did they do everything that they did so quickly with such great dexterity and precision? And I say to myself, why is it that we can't do that all the time? Is it a matter of discipline? Is it a matter of commitment? What is it? And it's a part of our human condition, and I continue to believe that we can do that if we try hard enough. And I recognize that there are great attributes of the parliamentary system that would be more efficient and more effective than the system that we have with three distinct branches here in the United States. As a matter of fact, most legislators, and I haven't been one, but Dan has, I have noticed not only want to be a part of the legislative branch of government, but they simultaneously and at the same moment want to be a part of the executive branch of government too, because they typically have all kinds of advice and counsel for those of us who work in the executive branch about how it is that we can live up to their expectations. In the parliamentary system, of course, the legislators are the executive branch, and there is great efficiency in that, and there are attributes, I think, positive aspects of that system. It's probably a fact, however, practically, that we couldn't expect that there would be such a massive change here that we would have overnight the capacity to have a parliamentary system of government. But I, living on the border up there, knew all of the premiers, and then I've had some assignments that have required me to be engaged with virtually all of the provinces, and with the Prime Minister, who is quite an interesting character. And I think that they're very satisfied with the process. It does have its efficiencies. It can change much more rapidly, much more precipitously than the system that we enjoy here in the United States of America. They do run on party platforms that are universal across the country, that can be impacted from a national perspective in a broad-based way. I think that having local impacts and local input and local policies and diversity of opinion, which is much more possible and encouraged under our system, is a strength. So on the whole, at the end of the day, I would probably choose our system over the parliamentary system, although I recognize that there are great efficiencies. In terms of policy, I don't have a large policy role. The parties don't have a large policy role. We certainly can report what we're hearing and seeing around the country to those who actually are making policy. But that's largely a functional reserve for the executive and legislative branches. And it's different in Canada, as you point out.
I think what we're going to do is we're going to take two more questions, and then there's going to be a reception afterwards that everybody's invited to on the 5th floor of the Taubman building across the way. So you'll have an opportunity to get more questions asked. This gentleman, and that's going to be it. Yes.
Good evening, Governor Roscoe, Secretary Glickman. I am Terrence Gilchrist, first-year master's student here at the Kennedy School of Government and Public Policy Program. I appreciate hearing what you had to say about connecting with the American Black community. My question is really bipartisan. My politics is independent, although I have participated as an election official in Columbus, Ohio. I want to know what specifically are these parties doing for enfranchisement? In Florida, 2000, yes, the facts did seem to suggest a particular outcome, which the Supreme Court upheld. However, there are also facts that people were intimidated at the polls, that people such as Haitian citizens were not able to read what was at the poll for the reason that they needed a translator. And also, former inmates who are now regaining their rights as citizens were told a lie that they could not vote any longer. So what specifically are these parties doing to ensure that people who want to vote are able to vote so that a true voice is heard in America? Even in Columbus, Ohio, at the polls as an election official, elderly people would enter the poll and the print was so fine that they were not able to distinguish who they wanted to vote for or even the issues. So perhaps internet voting should be available in all 50 states.
Well, I think there are two questions there, both of them relevant. And in reference to the first question concerning election reform, I think that's why there's going to be a bill that does move through Congress. And I believe every effort will be undertaken to make it as competent and as full of integrity as it can possibly be. They have not been perfect elections. We have learned a lot of very important lessons over the course of the last year or 2 years. In terms of intimidation, if there is a proof of a purposeful design or strategy that in any way impacts that, you're talking about violations of federal law that carry huge and very substantial penalties, and state law. So I think we have in place the statutory framework. We need to make the investments in appropriate technologies and in personnel to be able to execute in a way that affords everyone the opportunity to participate. In terms of reaching out to communities which may not have been involved in Republican politics in the past, I don't know what the DNC is doing. See, I'm a Republican by choice, not by birth. You know, I grew up in a strongly Democrat family, and my dad was a Franklin D. Roosevelt Democrat, and for good reason. You know, he was a child of the Depression. He delivered newspapers when he was 7 years old from 7 o'clock till 10 o'clock at night. His mother stayed up all night breaking bread, and he delivered it in the morning. And Franklin Roosevelt led us through a difficult period of time, and my dad believed in him. And he believed in Harry Truman. And I know he voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980 because in 1984 he admitted it when he did it again. And so over the course of his life, he changed his views somewhat. He became less partisan, more independent. And I know that there are a huge number of people out there, in my heart, I believe, who are Republicans, but they don't yet know it. And so I think I need to go around and I need to prove to them that I'm relevant in their life.
I feel like I'm being wooed here.
I think I need to be relevant in their life. And how are you relevant in their life? You start with trust. And I think that is the importance of investing them with discretion to act on your behalf. That's why a cabinet and appointed officers are important. Secondly, I think you have to be relevant to, and consider the issues that are important to them. If the issue of education is important to African Americans, then that's what you better be thinking about. And you better respond to that community. And the same is true of virtually every other issue that's important to them. So we have to frame our policy in keeping with our values in a way that reflects their priorities. If you're not willing to put in that effort, then you can expect that you're not going to have the friendship and relationship with them that you want.
Okay. Yes.
Sir, my name is Bill McCamley. I am a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. I'm from Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I also happen to be one of the chairmen of the Kennedy School Democratic Caucus.
I'm delighted to meet you.
And though I disagree with 90 to 95% of what you said, I do appreciate you here sharing an intellectual political discourse. My question resides on work. Let's just say, hypothetically, that November comes around, and the Democrats do hold a majority in one of the two houses of Congress. Presidential election stuff will start right away, pretty much. I mean, they start 2 years before the presidential election. So if the Democrats do hold control of one of those houses, or even are very, very close to control in the Senate, where they can use all sorts of means to hold things up.
Investigative techniques, yes.
Yes, sir. What is the prognosis for the next 2 years when you're going to have a lot of Democratic congressmen and senators that are going to be running for that presidential office? You're going to have Bush, who's also going to be running. What is the prognosis for getting anything done over the next 2 years? I get very concerned that a lot of times elections come around and people get so caught up in the elections they forget, hey, we're making laws here, we're getting stuff done for the people. So,
Bill, you need to come out on the road with me. That's the argument I'm making to the nation for why they should elect Republicans.
Although one could argue that what Americans really want is 1 foot on the brake and 1 foot on the accelerator.
I think that the Americans do have a keen sense of balance. And let me tell you, as an executive, I serve with both non-Republican House and Senate and all the houses and the governor's office being Republican. And in some ways, it's easier to be a Republican governor with a Democratic legislature. But in some ways, at the end of the day, you wouldn't choose that. I think it will be. I mean, if it doesn't, if one house is maintained Democratic, or both houses go Democratic, I think it'll be infinitely more difficult for the president. And it will be a substantial number of distractions. There will be a great deal of posturing. By my count, there are at least 5 or 6 Democratic senators who are potentially running for president. They will be competing with each other as well as with the President of the United States. So I think the business of the country can become paralyzed somewhat if that happens. I know, however, this president, because he was my friend before he was president, and I know that he wants to do something. He wants to work with people, and he wants to get something done. And I think that's why you saw the reflection of admiration and affection between he and Ted Kennedy. Is because he genuinely will work to get things done. Everybody says that about him. That's been my experience with him. So I know he'll make every best effort. But I do think it'll be much more difficult.
Well, let me say this. First of all, again, I want to invite everybody to a reception on the 5th floor of Taubman right afterwards. I think that Mark Roscoe has demonstrated that while he is somewhat misguided on his policy positions, he is one of the most decent people in the American political system. I don't think that I've met anybody in politics who wants to elevate the debate and wants to encourage participation in the American political process.
In both parties.
In both parties. So we are glad that you have come here, and we, I think, have been edified immensely by your remarks today.
Let me say that I am genuinely grateful to the school and to this institution of higher learning. You can't imagine what a far distance it is from a little lumber town in northwestern Montana to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I thank you for your decency, for your probing questions, and for the courteous discourse that we've had this afternoon. I genuinely appreciate it.
Thank you all. Good job. Great job. Great job.
Should have asked me. You were in the perfect position.
Thanks for the night.
Hand up.
Yeah,
Yeah.